Across Africa, a quiet but consequential shift is taking place, one that is reshaping relationships with the world's most powerful financial institutions and challenging long-standing assumptions about development, debt, and economic control. For decades, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have played a central role in African economies, offering loans, technical assistance, and policy guidance in moments of financial crisis. These institutions were created in the aftermath of the Second World War, designed to stabilize the global economy and support reconstruction. Over time, they became deeply embedded in the economic frameworks of developing nations, particularly across Africa. Now, a growing number of African governments are questioning whether that relationship has truly delivered prosperity or whether it has entrenched dependency. From West Africa to Southern Africa, leaders are reassessing debt agreements, renegotiating loan terms, and, in some cases, openly rejecting conditions attached to international financing. Supporters describe this moment as a long overdue assertion of economic sovereignty. Critics warn that the risks are substantial and that disengaging from global financial institutions could trigger instability. At the center of the debate is debt. Africa's external debt has risen sharply over the past 2 decades, driven by infrastructure investment, population growth, commodity price fluctuations, and repeated economic shocks. According to international data, African countries now owe hundreds of billions of dollars to a mix of creditors, including Western governments, private lenders, multilateral institutions, and increasingly non-Western partners. The IMF and World Bank argue that their loans are designed to stabilize economies, promote growth, and prevent deeper crises. Yet many African policymakers and economists contend that the conditions attached to these loans, often referred to as structural adjustment measures, have constrained development rather than enabled it. These conditions frequently include reductions in public spending, currency devaluation, subsidy removal, and market liberalization. While intended to restore fiscal balance, critics say they have sometimes weakened social services, increased inequality, and limited government's ability to invest in long-term development. In recent years, frustration has become more vocal. In Ghana, Zambia, Kenya, and other countries, debates over IMF programs have spilled into public discourse, with civil society groups questioning whether austerity measures disproportionately affect ordinary citizens while failing to address structural economic weaknesses. In some cases, governments have delayed or resisted entering IMF programs altogether, citing concerns over political autonomy and social impact. This resistance reflects a broader rethinking of development models across the continent. African leaders increasingly argue that the traditional debt-driven approach has not delivered industrialization at the scale required to absorb rapidly growing populations. While some countries have experienced periods of growth, many remain vulnerable to external shocks, commodity dependence, and capital flight. The COVID-19 pandemic intensified these concerns. As global economies shut down, African nations faced collapsing revenues, rising healthcare costs, and mounting debt obligations. Emergency financing from international institutions provided short-term relief, but also reinforced questions about long-term sustainability. At the same time, alternative partnerships began to gain prominence. Countries such as China, India, and members of the Gulf Cooperation Council expanded their economic engagement across Africa, offering loans, investment, and infrastructure projects often framed as less conditional than those of Western institutions. While these arrangements are not without controversy, they have broadened Africa's options and strengthened its bargaining position. The emergence of multilateral groupings like BRICS has further altered the landscape. African nations joining or aligning with these blocs see opportunities to access financing, trade, and development models outside traditional Western frameworks. Supporters say this diversification reduces vulnerability to any single lender. Critics warn that it may simply replace one form of dependency with another. Within the IMF and World Bank themselves, there is recognition that change is necessary. Officials have acknowledged criticisms of past structural adjustment programs and point to reforms aimed at increasing flexibility, social protection, and country-specific solutions. Debt relief initiatives, including those launched during the pandemic, are cited as evidence of adaptation, yet skepticism remains. African economists argue that decision-making power within these institutions still rests largely with Western nations, limiting Africa's influence over policies that directly affect its economies. Voting structures and leadership appointments are often highlighted as symbols of this imbalance. Public opinion across Africa has also evolved. Younger generations, more connected through digital platforms and exposed to global discourse, are increasingly questioning narratives that frame external oversight as inevitable or beneficial. Economic sovereignty, once a niche academic concept, is now a mainstream political issue. Protests against rising living costs, currency depreciation, and subsidy cuts have occurred in several countries, often linked directly or indirectly to IMF-backed reforms. Governments find themselves under pressure not only from creditors but from citizens demanding alternatives. In West Africa, military-led governments have explicitly framed their rejection of certain financial arrangements as part of a broader push for independence from external control. While these positions remain controversial internationally, they resonate with populations that feel excluded from the benefits of globalization. In Southern and East Africa, the approach has been more measured but no less significant. Governments are renegotiating debt terms, seeking longer repayment periods, and prioritizing domestic industrial capacity. Western governments have responded with caution. Officials emphasize that the IMF and World Bank remain essential to global financial stability and argue that abandoning them risks market isolation. They warn that private investors may withdraw if countries are perceived as unpredictable or confrontational. At the same time, Western policymakers are aware that Africa's importance to the global economy is growing. The continent holds vast reserves of critical minerals essential for renewable energy and electric vehicles. Its population is young, expanding, and increasingly urbanized. This reality gives African nations leverage. By asserting greater control over financing and development pathways, they are signaling that economic relationships must evolve or risk becoming obsolete. For the IMF and World Bank, the challenge is existential. Can institutions designed in the mid-20th century adapt to a multipolar world where developing nations demand partnership rather than prescription? Or will alternative financial architectures gradually erode their relevance? The answer may depend on whether reforms translate into tangible changes on the ground. As Africa navigates this transition, the stakes are high. Missteps could trigger inflation, capital flight, or fiscal crises. Success, however, could redefine development on the continent and alter the balance of global economic power. What is clear is that the conversation has changed. Debt is no longer discussed solely in terms of repayment schedules and fiscal ratios. It is now deeply intertwined with questions of dignity, sovereignty, and historical justice. And as Africa pushes back against systems it sees as limiting, the world is watching closely.